Good evening. Good evening. My name is Wally Verdoren. I am the Director of Development here at the Oriental Institute. Welcome to another monthly members lecture here at the Oriental Institute. And we also want to welcome all those who are joining us online via live streaming. Greetings to our virtual fans of ancient Middle Eastern studies, wherever you may be in the world today. Tonight's lecture is also particularly special because our speaker will be presenting the second Marija Gimbutas Memorial Lecture here at the Oriental Institute. This lecture honors the groundbreaking work of this very important scholar, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about a little later in tonight's program. We are also very grateful to Audrius and Sigita Pliopoulos, longtime supporters of the Oriental Institute and the University of Chicago, for their generous sponsorship of both the first and now the second Gimbutas Lecture here at the Oriental Institute. I'm very pleased that Audrius is here with us this evening, and he has some brief remarks that he'd like to share with us before our lecture begins. Audrius?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who's here. The weather isn't particularly pleasant, so it's wonderful to see so many people willing to risk the snow and the storm that's taking place right now. So thank you very much for coming. We do have two, besides everyone here who's distinguished, we do have special distinguished guests here. Mantvydas Bekešis, the Consul General of Lithuania, is here, and Ieva Delytė, the Cultural Attaché of Lithuania, came also. So that's very pleasant to have you here. Thank you for coming. I met Marija Gimbutas twice during lectures she gave in Chicago. The second time was just a few months before she passed away. She was a legend at that time, and my own interest in origin of my own background led to studies of the origins of Indo-European culture. She had her own theory of where Indo-Europeans came from, and that's one of her major academic accomplishments in this area, called the Kurgan hypothesis, which will be talked about later today by Petra in more detail. She was born and raised in Lithuania like my parents were, and escaped the ravages of Stalin's atrocities just like my parents did. She finished her education in Germany and then moved to the Boston area, where she continued her archaeological research for 13 years. Then a few years ago, I found out the details of what she had to go through. To continue her work, she did affiliate with Harvard University. She was given a desk in the basement of Peabody Museum, and she taught courses there. She did research. She published articles. She published books, and she had no title and no salary. She considered this very active misogyny, and it certainly was discrimination against her that took place. But she persevered, and eventually was offered a job at UCLA with a title, professor, and with a salary, if you can believe it. And so she had to move to Los Angeles for professional development. When I learned about the difficulties that she went through, and for her career, I felt an obligation that she especially needed to be honored with a lecture series at an institution appropriate to her accomplishments. And that's where the Oriental Institute fits in, one of the top archaeological institutions in the world. So thank you, Chris, for allowing me to arrange these lectures here at the Oriental Institute. Now, in terms of the discrimination that she felt, over the past year, 2 years, there was another woman who underwent difficulties at Harvard University, but not in archaeology, in law. And these are now very well-known documentary films about Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she was there at the same time that Marija Gimbutas was there. But the difficulties that Marija faced were massively bigger, I think. And I think that the underlying reason is a twofold discrimination. One was that she was a woman. Secondly, that she was an immigrant from Eastern Europe and could be taken advantage of, which her colleagues did. Her colleagues there asked her to translate many articles for them. She knew many different European languages. She did it for free with no recognition. to keep her, position at Harvard, what it was, intact. So now I do want to make a side comment. I don't want to disparage Harvard University at all. The same kind of thing would have taken place and was taking place, I think, at every major academic center in the United States. So, thank you very much for coming here today, everybody, to honor this woman of incredible accomplishment. Thank you.
Well, in addition to Audrius and Sagita, I also want to express my thanks to all the Oriental Institute members who are with us tonight. The annual and ongoing support from our members makes possible programs like this lecture, monthly lecture series, and also provides resources to the pioneering research and discovery that is still being led today by OI faculty members and researchers. If you're not a member yet, consider joining and supporting all the scholarly adventures at the OI. So now let's get our lecture program started. I'm pleased to call to the podium Christopher Woods, the John A. Wilson Professor and the Director of the Oriental Institute, who will introduce today's speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Wally, and thank you all for coming, and especially thank you, Audrius, on behalf of all of us at the Oriental Institute for sponsoring this wonderful lecture, now our second lecture in honor of Marija Gimbutas. It's always a very special honor for me to introduce one of my colleagues. Tonight's speaker, Petra Goedegebuure, is Professor of Hittitology here at the OI and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And along with Professor Theo Vandenhout, she is a senior editor of the Chicago Hittite Dictionary. Petra joined our faculty in 2006, having received her PhD in Hittitology from the University of Amsterdam in 2003, and her MA in Semitic Languages and Cultures from Amsterdam in 1994. Prior to her arrival at Chicago, Petra was adjunct assistant professor of Anatolian languages and cultures at Leiden University. Petra's primary research interest is linguistic Hittitology, which means that she uses linguistic analysis to gain a better understanding of the interactions of Hittite texts and society. Petra's research and teaching operate at the intersection of linguistics, philology, and cultural analysis of the societies that produce these texts. Her specific research interests cover several closely interrelated fields of linguistics from a functional and typological perspective. These include syntactic alignment, discourse cohesion, information structure, and language change in contact situations. Several of her projects have been awarded fellowships from the Netherlands Organization of Scientific Research, the Franke Institute of the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. Now, having worked very closely with Petra for over a decade now and sharing many of the same linguistic interests of her, I would like to personally point out the incredible and I think really unparalleled rigor of Petra's research, which combines flawless philology, a deep knowledge of linguistic theory and method, and an intimate familiarity with the Hittite world, its history and culture. Now, in terms of linguistic knowledge and sophistication, in my view, there are only a handful of scholars across all the fields of the ancient Near East who can claim to be her peer. This profound knowledge of linguistic method and theory means that Petra is not simply using linguistics as a tool to understand ancient Anatolian languages, but is at the same time making fundamental contributions to general linguistics more broadly, particularly in the areas of pragmatics, functionalism, typology, as well as Proto-European phonology, lexicon, and syntax. Nowhere is Petra's characteristic rigor more apparent than in her pioneering 2014 book, The Hittite Demonstratives, Studies in Deixis, Topics, and Focus, which offers a thoroughly in-depth account of the workings of the Hittite deictic system, that is, the demonstrative pronouns and related items that anchor utterances, anchor speech in the extra-linguistic reality. These are words that bond the universe of language to the physical world and are absolutely essential for a deep understanding of language and texts. Taken together with her many articles and her forthcoming monograph, Expressing Agency and Point of View, the core cases in the ancient Anatolian languages, 1700 to 300 BCE, it's clear that Petra is laying the foundation for nothing less than a new theory of information structure in Hittite. Now, tonight, in Petra's talk, Anatolians on the Move, from Kurgans to Kanesh, Petra will be speaking about the origins of the Hittites from a linguistic perspective and how this relates to the question of Indo-European origins and the ancient DNA evidence that has recently been brought to bear on this debate. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Petra Goedegebuure.
Well, Chris, thank you for this amazing introduction. I realized suddenly I'm a bit out of my comfort zone with this topic. So I do hope that it will be up to the standard you just laid out about my own work. So no, it's not only going to be about linguistics. I will talk about linguistics, but I will also talk about Hittite legends. I will talk a bit about archaeology. I will talk about DNA, but mostly I want to combine this to see if we can say something about where the Anatolians come from. Is this going well? Am I clear enough? Okay. A little bit louder. Maybe I should stay closer to this. Is this better? Oh, okay. So if you may recall that, I forgot to say, I wanted to thank you for the honor of presenting the second Marija Gimbutas Memorial Lecture, and especially for allowing me to follow up on Colin Renfrew, who made such gave such a stunning presentation. As you may know, he basically retracted his own theory about where the Indo-Europeans came from. He was the major proponent of the Indo-Europeans come out of Anatolia. And that, of course, was opposed to Marija Gimbutas' original view that the Proto-Indo-Europeans, of course, the Proto-Indo-Europeans are a people that spoke a reconstructed language, Proto-Indo-European, from which all the European languages descend, like Germanic or Slavic or Anatolian Hittite for that matter, English, Sanskrit, Tokharian in China. So Gimbutas said, no, the Indo-Europeans, they come from north of the Black Sea, the Pontic-Caspic region. And they came in 3 waves between 4000 and BC and 2500, and they spread from north of the Black Sea west into Europe, east into Asia and India, and Asia, and then also into Anatolia. Renfrew, in his presentation, said she was fully vindicated by ancient DNA studies that really show that Indo-Europeans showed up in Europe, spreading a certain type of culture based on horses, chariots with wheels, wheel chariots, of course. And but what Renfrew also said, there is a problem still. What happened in Anatolia? And this is what I want to explore today. I'm not going to give the final answer because that will take a lot of ancient DNA studies, but I want to lay out a model of what could have been the case in Anatolia. I will talk about the Hittite legend, as I said. I will talk about language context situation in the late 3rd millennium. I will then look at how do we find homelands, and how did I then want to try to answer how did the Anatolians enter Anatolia through the west or the east. I will then look at wine in Hittite, but in a language you have never heard of, Ghattian. And then what does ancient DNA contribute, potentially? So to summarize again, we have 2 competing models. That's I like movies, I like bad movies. This is a still from Highlander. And the point is, this figure represents the Kurgan, a wild, ferocious, evil Indo-European. So the Gimbutas model, Pontic Indo-Europeans are from north of the Black Sea. There are specific characteristics to their culture. They have Kurgans, burial mounds. And they had the horse, they had wheels, wagons, which means they could spread fast at one point, and they were patrifocal. They spread in 3 waves, as I mentioned, over Europe and the East. And what they did was conquer like sedentary, more peaceful, egalitarian old Europe. The other model was Renfrew's model. No, Indo-Europeans are from Anatolia. And they didn't start spreading in 4000, they start spreading with the invention, if you want to say, the farming spread over Europe, and that is the only time you can talk about spread of people. You know, every new generation would start a new farm a little bit further away from the homestead. And this was not a violent conquest, so from Anatolia and much earlier. And then, as I said, I like movies. Unfortunately, Europeans continue to be depicted in the worst possible ways. Here in this movie, Prometheus, they are impossibly white, violent Übermenschen who dissolve themselves. They're extraterrestrials. They kill themselves to spread the DNA, and this is how the human race started. I find it also a little bit racist, to be honest, but okay. And they spoke Indo-European. That's kind of missed in the whole, but they did speak Indo-European. You can see that at one point in the movie when a robot is learning the language. Going back to more serious stuff, so these are the 2 models summarized with their spreads. The north, that's the, now I can figure out how this works. Yes, here, the pink part, that's north of the Black Sea, the Gimbutas model, and here, Turkey. That's where, according to Renfrew, the Indo-Europeans would come from. But he retracted that partially. What he said, what happened in Anatolia? Maybe ancient DNA will still, prove that there was a first homeland, as it were, and that north of the Black Sea there would be a second homeland. Let's investigate that. So Hittites, we need to look first, Anatolian Indo-Europeans, where were they? The Hittite Empire is the Anatolian Indo-European state in Turkey. And the green kind of shows the extent of their state. And a little bit to the north, Pala. So there were several speakers of this Anatolian Indo-European. You have Hittite, our documents attest to Hittite. Our document attests to Pelayik, a related language. We believe that the people who spoke that language lived here. And we have Luwian attested in both cuneiform tablets, Hittite is written in cuneiform, and in indigenous hieroglyphic script. This shows the distribution of hieroglyphic Luwian monuments throughout Turkey. As you can see, pretty widely distributed. So going back, Hittite is spoken here, Pelayik was once spoken, preserved in the Hittite archives, and Luwian is it's very possible that that is actually the language of the majority of the population, so very widely distributed. Art, I won't talk a lot or hardly anything. I will hardly say anything about Hittite art, but I wanted to show you some pictures of their beautiful metalwork. This is the Lion Gate in Hattusha, and that ivory plaque is in the museum. So if you have time, find it. It's beautiful. Let's start with a legend. So we saw that the Hittites and the Illyrians and the Pelasgians, they were all over Turkey. But this is not where they started, of course. So I want to go back in time and see what do our oldest documents say about where the Hittites are from. And for that we have to look at Kültepe Kanesh. Kültepe is the Turkish name, Kanesh is the name they use it themselves. It's kind of central. I've marked it in blue, and that's an image of the excavation of the mound. And they are mentioned for the first time. Kanesh is mentioned in the documents from the old Assyrian merchant period, 1720 BCE. So this is a period where the Assyrians had spread out through Anatolia and had set up a network of posts in Anatolian cities. And in Kültepe, I think alone, they excavated 22,000 tablets. And in those tablets, it's written in Old Assyrian, but there's a lot of mention of Anatolians. So we know, based on the names, that the people who lived there already spoke Hittite and Luwian. So very early on, this is early evidence of the presence of Anatolians in Kanesh. But we also have legends. And this is a legend that talks about, I believe, it's a foundation myth about where the Hittites think they come from. It's the legend of the queen of Kanesh who gave birth to 30 sons and 30 daughters, which is a lot. And those 30 sons, she puts in a basket. We have heard of basket children before. The queen of Kanesh gave birth to 30 sons in 1 year. She said, what is this horde or terror or something, we don't know the exact meaning of the word, that I have given birth to? She filled baskets with grease and put her sons in them. She released them to the river carried them to the sea, to Zalpa. I want to go back. Zalpa is over there, to the north, top. And the gods picked them up and raised them. Now, of course, kids in a basket, babies in a basket down a river. Think of Moses. Think of Sargon of Akkad. Think of Romulus and Remus. These are founder myths. These are people who become leaders. And the fact that we find this type of topos in this Hittite legend means that we're talking about a founding myth. This is how the Hittites see themselves. The years went by, and the queen gave birth again to 30 daughters. She raises herself. When the sons traveled to Nesha, Kanesh, the gods gave them a different character. So they didn't care that they were the sisters. Presumably the mother didn't recognize them. So the queen gave her daughters to her sons. The oldest sons did not acknowledge them as sisters, but the youngest ones said, we're marrying our sisters. Do not approach them. It's not right. And they slept with them. And then, of course, the text breaks off. And at the most crucial moment in Hittite history, it seems. So we don't know what happened. So we can only speculate. I think, of course, they were not really to blame. I think the youngest son did not marry his sister, and I think that brother and sister were therefore rewarded with kingship, ruling brother and sister. And I believe that this tale not only talks about the merger of the northern tradition of Zalpa, which is Ghatik, and we will get there, with the southern Hittites. It is also a tale that explains how brother-sister couples could rule as king and queen without, of course, these are not Egyptian pharaohs or something. So there's no incest involved. They have other spouses, and the son, not the son of the king, becomes the next king, but the son of the sister of the king, the nephew, becomes the next king. The important for today is that it talks basically about a merger of the northern tradition and the southern, Chattian and the Hittites. And they are basically depicted as family. So, to the north, the red is where we find the Chattians initially. And to the south, the blue is where we find the Hittites. So before the Hittites basically took over, the Chattians ruled in the center of Anatolia. They didn't leave writing, so all we know about them is what is preserved in the Hittite archives. It is a language that is very difficult. So these are some images of their art. It's a difficult language. We have about 300 tablets. We have a few bilingual texts, which is great, so we can at least understand some of the texts. But of the monolingual text, I find it extremely hard still to get even one step further. I will give a nice example of how much we do not understand later. But these were cities, complex societies. We know that the deities were incorporated in the Hittite pantheon. We see all those names show up. So it was a complete merger of cultures. Hittites and Chattians, they merged. And that is going to tell us something about what happened in, we're going a little bit further back in time, what happened in prehistory. When languages are in contact, when people immigrate, the languages that are involved will change. So think of immigrants. When an immigrant like me, a Dutch person, when I speak English, I'm not going to use Dutch. I'm not going to insert my Dutch words in my language when I talk with you. But what will happen is what I cannot control is the way I sound. I will not sound like an American unless I was born here as a bilingual. And what may happen is that I change word order, I make mistakes. These are very difficult to control. So a context situation with immigrants in large numbers, for example, moving in, they will influence the language that they learn to speak, not with the words, but with the way it sounds, and the word order changes, for example, if the languages are different enough. The socio-politically dominant people, conquerors or maybe natives, they may borrow words from the incoming culture, maybe food stuff. But what will not happen so much is influence. My way of speaking English is not going to influence your way of speaking English. So the point is we see different types of influence. Language changes in different ways depending who is speaking the language, the immigrant or the native, the conquered person or the conqueror. Now, you can apply this to what happened with Hittite and Hattic or Chattian. If you make an inventory, you will find 30 words that are borrowed in Hittite. Not very much, that's really not much, but they are related to restricted cultural domains, words like district, palace, throne, singer, priest. So, and that's it. That's all the influence of Hattic or Chattian on Hittite. If you now look, it's more important that you see the gray and the white than exactly what I put up there. But my claim is that Chattian changed a lot. Chattian had different word order from Hittite. It's called a VO language. Hittite is an OV language. And that means that the verb is at the end of a sentence in Hittite and the verb is at the beginning of a sentence in Chattian. And that correlates with a lot of word order phenomena. And if you look at what an OV language should look like, that's the OV correlate column, and you compare what Hittite does as an OV language, it's completely consistent with what we know about OV languages. If you look at Hattic or Chattian, in the right column you see the VO correlate, but if you look at what happened in Chattian, it started looking more like Hittite and Luwian in word order. And there are quite a few slots that are now gray and not white. So what happened is Hattien underwent what we call typological disruption. Something was changing the language structure. And if you remember, immigrants who speak another language, they may cause changes in word order. So my claim is, well, Hittite borrowed a few words only. Hittite is not new. Hittites were just speaking Hittite. But Hattien, they didn't borrow Hittite words, but there were major word order changes that were not expected to happen unless it was caused by other people who spoke another type of language. So Hattien had become the new language for a large subordinate group of speakers of either Hittite or Luwian. I argue that it is Luwian, but it goes too far to explain why that is the case now. And that group is large enough to influence even the language of native speakers. As everyone around you starts speaking differently, you yourself as a native speaker might do that too. Start doing it too. So there were two migrations. There's a migration in large numbers of speakers of Luwian into Hattien society in a socio-politically subordinate position, fully merging with Hattien people. The date of the merger, unfortunately, is unknown, but this, of course, has major consequences for DNA. You will not find Indo-European DNA, is my claim. You will find a very strong admixture. And much later, Hittites do conquer, historically, we know when it happened in 7050, they do start conquering the area to the north. So we have this picture around 2000. I mean, this is an estimate. There may be Luwians much further to the west. I don't know. The point is that Hattien was spoken by people from Hattien and Palaic background in the north. Remember that I mentioned Pala. And a little bit in the core area, probably Hattien and Luwian. So this is a mix of people from different backgrounds who live in one society, ruled by Hattiens. And to the southeast a little bit, we find the Hittites, who then soon move in to take over. You keep this in mind, because this is going to show up again. So by the way, we had this Hittite legend which talks about Hattiens and Hittites being family. Linguistically, we really can support this for the prehistoric period. I call it prehistoric because we do not have written Hittites around 2000, only for names. We do not have the texts. So let's now make a jump further back in time. We had the Hittite Empire. We kind of reduced it to Kanesh, that blue region, Kanesh. We had the myth that talked about that. We went a little bit further back in time and claimed that Luwian had merged with Hattien. Let's make a real jump back to where the Hittites potentially come from. And how do you find this out? What is the method? Well, there are general assumptions. Dispersal of language is connected with migration of population groups. So you can look at DNA. Distinct population groups have distinct material, culture, and habits. So you look at archaeology, burial customs, pottery types, innovative technology. Think of the wheel and the wagon for the Indo-Europeans. And distinct population groups also may share a language or a dialect, so you look at linguistics. And languages are spoken by a people with a certain culture. If languages are related, then expressions of culture may be related. So if you find a certain word for wheel in German and wiel in Dutch, it's going to be related. Because the way they look, or sound, I should say, and the fact that both have the wheel, of course, for modern societies, that is not a good example, but for very ancient societies, having the wheel is a good example. To check whether societies are cognate. Culture can be reconstructed based on lexicon words, because if you have a word for it, you have the concept, and that's called linguistic paleontology. And cultures have unique concepts and artifacts. So this cluster we're going to use. Think of words. Nice example. Food baby, very typical American expression. These are, well, they're not untranslatable. When you eat so much that your stomach looks pregnant. In Dutch we have the word gezelligheid, which is kind of coziness. Tardel, the act of hesitating while introducing someone because you've forgotten their name. Somehow the Scots have a word for this. And then my favorite always is tingo, the act of taking objects one desires from the house of a friend by gradually borrowing all of them. So we have culturally specific words that say something about a culture. Now, and if you see me wear those, I don't have to say where I come from, those clogs. So this is a typical expression of Dutch culture. Some traditional clothing, some older traditional clothing. So we had some words that are specific to societies. We have artifacts that are specific to societies. So with linguistic paleontology, you know, reconstructing words, you can use the reconstructed lexicon to reconstruct concepts. If you have the word for a dog, you will have dogs in your society. If you have the word for wagon, you will have the wagon in your society. So you can recreate the environment by looking at the words that you can reconstruct. And then archaeology can come in to try to find those artifacts. So if you have an assemblage of a certain, you know, if you know that there is a culture, and that's the only culture that uses wagons and yokes and axles, you have words for that, you are going to look for the culture, you are going to look for the area where that is attested for the first time. The first appearance of those artifacts then provides a temporal horizon and a place of origin. And this is exactly what those who supported the Gimbutas model did. They reconstructed in the European society, and they said, well, this society, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, they had the horse, and they had the wheel, and there were many other words, but these are the best examples. And where do we find that? Well, we find that north of the Black Sea. There's archaeological evidence that this is where the wheel was invented, this is where the wagon was invented, and this is where the horse was domesticated. And those you needed, this was needed to spread out. So linguistic paleontology was completely proven valid as a method to find homelands. When the ancient DNA material in the last couple of years showed up and proved that this culture spread out over Europe and Asia. So, but if that's the case, we can do this for Hittite as well. We can do this for the Anatolian languages. If it worked for finding the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, we can use those words to look at what happened with the Anatolians. Were they there too, or were they somewhere else? Okay, the horse was domesticated around 4000 BC in the Ukraine. And together with wagons, as I said, they transformed the local societies, Eurasian societies. The archaeological term for the culture of the Indo-Europeans is the Yamnaya. Well, in Hittite, the word is not attested in Hittite. We have a Luwian word, and you can reconstruct hekyu. But the word for horse in all the other languages is hekwo. It looks alike, but it's not the same. So somehow, well, we know, we believe that Hittite or Anatolian was the first to split up, so that could explain the difference that all the other languages developed their word for horse a little bit differently. More important, I find, is in many Indo-European societies, horses were very important. They were buried with leaders, for example. Nothing like that in Hittite society. It might imply that the horse simply did not play an important cultic role. But, okay, that is not yet enough evidence to say, well, the Hittites weren't there when the horse was domesticated. Let's look at terminology for wagons and wheels. If the Anatolians were there, north of the Black Sea, when the wheel was invented, we expect that word also to show up in Anatolian. Now, the words for wheel that have been reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European are kweklo and rote. Wheel is a literal descendant of kweklo, or kyklos in Greek, chakra in Sanskrit. Yet Hittite does not use that word. It has a different word for wheel, churki, based on to turn. So all the other Indo-European languages use words that derive from these two, kweklo and rote. Hittite does not. Axles, of course, are important for wagons and wheels. For all these other Indo-European languages, we can reconstruct a word for axle, hjeks, but Hittite borrowed it from Akkadian. Now, if linguistic paleontology worked to find a homeland, and this was used to, if the assumption is you need to share a word, the same word, then Hittite does not share. You need to share those words. You need to, if all those languages split off from a period and a place where the wheel was in existence, then, and Hittite would have been there too, you would expect kweklo or rote, but you don't, you have another word. And Anatolian, therefore, did not share the wagon terminology with the rest of Proto-Indo-European, and therefore Anatolian split off before the wheel was invented. And when they encountered the wheel maybe who knows how long later, they took their own word for it. They did not participate in the development that the other languages participated in. So Anatolian split off before 4000, 3000 BCE, but they could still, it could still be 4000. Then I looked at agriculture. Remember, agriculture was very important for the run-through theory. So he said Indo-European spread with agriculture, with the spread of agriculture. So I started looking at those words. And if you look, well, English is difficult. I don't think you say, do you write plowing this way, or is it with a W? Or can I say this actually with a GH? It's good? Okay, good. The Hittite word for plow is terip. Every other language in the European language uses a different root. They use a term that is derived from Proto-Indo-European gerg. And the word trap does exist. It means simply to turn. So if everyone accepts that Anatolian separated from Indo-European before the invention of the wheel, using the arguments I just used, then this argument has to be used to say that Anatolian split off from Proto-Indo-European before the arrival of agriculture, before the arrival of farming. Anatolian did not share agricultural terminology with the rest of Proto-Indo-European. If they lived in the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea, that means that they left before 4500, because this is here when we see agriculture show up. So archaeology gives us a time frame. It gives us the time before they were supposed to have left. But if they lived in Anatolia, say the run-through theory is correct, and I think he still tends towards at least the Anatolians being in Anatolia and everyone else moving to north of the Black Sea. If Renfrew was correct with them being in Anatolia, then the Proto-Indo-European people proper, I call them peep, left before 8000 BC when farming started in Anatolia. So, do you follow the argument? The two groups must have split before farming was invented. Farming was invented in around started around 8000 BC in Anatolia. And that means that if everyone else moved out, that should have happened in 8000. That's about 4,000 years too soon. It doesn't work. Moreover, it actually kills the Anatolia theory of Renfrew, because it's crucial that that happened with the spread of agriculture. I say the two languages split before farming. So this is not the case. The Anatolians must have come from north of the Black Sea. It cannot be reconciled with a homeland in Anatolia. And how we arrive at that conclusion is by simply using linguistic paleontology that was also used to show that the Anatolians split from the Proto-Indo-Europeans before the invention of the wheel. If you accept that for one part as a method, you have to accept it for the rest as well. You cannot choose to use linguistic paleontology for one part of your model and not for another part of your model. So going back, okay, so we know that this is the case at one point, but they left north of the Black Sea. But how did they arrive in Turkey? That way? Or that way? We don't know yet. We just know that they had to come from the north and somehow got in. Let's take a look at the words for wine. Just for your background, the word for wine is an Indo-European word again. It's vion in Hittite, voinos in Greek, or oinos, vinum in Latin, wine in German. It's even borrowed in the languages of the Caucasus, and it is borrowed in the Semitic languages. So the Anatolians, the Indo-Europeans, they knew about wine. I said we have to look at Hattian. Hattian and Hittite society culture merged. Let's look what kind of word we have in Hattian for wine. Now, most of the words we simply don't know. We know that fulasni means bread, and usually you have bread, you have something to drink. I know that Zariun, pala means and, Zariun means man, kate means king, and tabarna is a royal title, and that's the end of our knowledge about these sentences. But having bread and something to drink, we need to look, okay, karamu, what kind of drink is that? Now, what we do know is that the Hittite word sagi, or that's not Hittite, it's Sumerian, is a beverage dispenser, serves wine to officials, and that correlates with Hattian wintu karam, again, our word karam. And then we have a text where in Hattian they say shayu le garam, and we know that shayu means Lord and le is his. It's wine for the Lord. So it is as little as we know about Hattic, and I'm very glad that I suppose the people who have seen Hattic went from 5 in the world to, I don't know how many, 100, 200. So that is a major increase of people who know Hattian. So, and we know that garam is wine, but let's look at where else we find a word, karan. That's Akkadian. So Hattian borrowed the word for wine from Akkadian. And when did that happen? Oh, before I go there, somewhere to the north were the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and with the Hittites, the word for wine came in and landed somewhere there. Keep this in mind. Wine has spread basically from Georgia. The cultivation of wine, the making of wine spread from Georgia, say around 6,000, India, and then 5,000 something, and then to the west. And in the mid-3rd millennium, we find references to winemaking. So presumably around 2,500, wine was made here, and this is also where we find the word for wine, karanu. So what I claim is around this time, the Hattians must have borrowed the word for wine as well. Trade, there was a lot of trade going on. So, of course, what will you trade? You are going to trade wine as a luxury good for the elite. And when you do that, you may also want to borrow the word. So now let's go to the Anatolians. Are they in the West or in the East? And when? So if my claim is that if Hattian borrowed the word for wine around 2500, I don't think the Hittites or Anatolians in general were in between. Would they not have borrowed another word? Would they not have been the intermediaries for providing the Hattians with wine? No, I think that when the Hattians encountered wine for the first time, the Anatolians were not to their south, where they later were. So I think we can set a limit to, we can set kind of we can say that around 2500, the Anatolians were not in between northern Syria and the Hattians. But where were they? They were to the east. It turns out that in the 24th century in Ebla, Ebla is right here. In Ebla, in the 24th century BCE, tablets mention people from a state called Armi, to the north, a bit to their north. And now the interesting thing is that that state of Armi, there are names of people, names with unknown origin, Semitic names, but you could say that's trade with the south, and Anatolian names. They have names like Duduwashu and Targhili. Those are really Anatolian names. So we won't find, I claim, speakers of Anatolian immediately south of the Hattians. And we do find them to the east, probably around the same time. So the question, did they come from the west over the Balkan or from the east over the Caucasus? I think there is some evidence that says, yes, they came from the east over the Caucasus. By blocking the center and seeing that there are Anatolian names around this period in a state called Armi. Now, here is where we want to bring in DNA, ancient DNA studies. And this is a very recent publication. So what the articles in this volume claim is all Indo-European populations have steppe ancestry, as Renfrew recognizes, acknowledges. Except for Bronze Age Anatolia, they have Caucasian ancestry. That's the East. And so the suggestion that they make is I have not been able to digest this myself, I want to look into this a little bit more, is that the Proto-Anatolians were at home in a culture called Maikop, a little bit north of the Caucasus, and a little bit south of the steppe. To show you how this works, how they can say this, they analyzed, of course, the DNA of certain, here, steppe DNA looks like this. It's a mixture of this turquoise, this is called Caucasian hunter-gatherer DNA, light blue, which is called Eastern hunter-gatherer DNA, and then a little bit purple, which is Neolithic farmer DNA. And this, if you compare this DNA from about the same period in Anatolia, completely different picture. So what does that look like? Neolithic, that's farmers, the farmers of Anatolia have this huge amount of purple Neolithic DNA and a little bit of turquoise. That's the Caucasian hunter-gatherer. And then suddenly, we see a big change in the Copper Age, where there is much more influx from the Caucasus. The DNA does not change so much in the steppe, but in Anatolia, it changes a lot. It just doesn't look like this. And let me go to the next one. The Neolithic DNA, that's this day, there's a low amount of Caucasian DNA, and suddenly in the Copper Age, a lot. So let's put some dates on that. Unfortunately, there's, it's like a huge amount of. Anyway, the change is from the Neolithic to the Copper Age, where we see a lot of influx of Caucasian DNA from the east, therefore. We do not see any changes in these periods. And this is the period when the Hittites live in central Anatolia, the Middle and the Late Bronze Age. That signal is almost the same. So whatever change happened in Anatolia, it happened in this period. So the only thing, so this really seems to show that this in the European Anatolians actually have Caucasian DNA, and that they came from the east. The only problem I have right now, and you would need more examples, is that these samples, there are only about 6 samples. That's not a lot to actually have build major, draw major conclusions from. My other problem is, where do these samples come from? From Kaman-Kalahuyuk, that arrow, and Nefshe here. And as you can see, it is in the area where I claim there was already heavy admixture. So whatever DNA we find, we are not going to find pure Hittite. That is the flaw in the studies. They think these are Hittite sites, and they think they're going to find Indo-European Anatolian DNA. But I'm going to claim, no, you will never find that, because for thousands of years, the Anatolians had been mixing with the local population. So whatever you find, it's going to be very mixed, and it's also going to be very different from the steppe DNA of the other Indo-Europeans. So my conclusions are, based on agricultural terminology, the Anatolians separated from Proto-Indo-European before the arrival of agriculture. The Neolithic farming arrived in the 7th millennium in Anatolia, but in the 6th millennium in the Caucasus. So Anatolia cannot have been the homeland of the Proto-Indo-Hittites, let's call them that. The separation between Proto-Anatolian and the rest must have taken place before the 5th millennium, before 5000. The Hattians borrowed the Akkadian word for wine around 2500. Had the Anatolians been there in between the Hattians and the Syrians, the Hattians would have known the word wian, but they didn't. So why borrow karam if your southern neighbors, the intermediaries, already have their own words? So around 2500 BC, I claim, the Anatolians weren't to the south of the Hattians yet. But there were Anatolians to the southeast in Army. And then finally, ancient DNA shows connection with the Caucasus. So I suggest that between 4500 and 2500, the Anatolians lived in the eastern regions of Anatolia. Question mark, because we really need more ancient DNA data. And this is something that I recently thought of, like today. I suddenly realized I haven't really ever focused on the Kura Araxes culture. But the timing coincides, and the location of where I think the Hittites or the Anatolians were coincides. And they seem to have been at the periphery of this culture. And then browsing the literature, there are indeed people who say that the Indo-Europeans, that the Kura Araxes should be equated with the Indo-Europeans. I shouldn't go that far. It's probably a mixture of many different societies that created that. But this needs to be restudied. This needs to be investigated. If we want to find a trace of the Proto-Anatolians, the Hittites, I think we should look to the east and not to the west. Thank you.
And we have time for a few questions.
So, of course, the name, some people claim that. So, in Akkadian or Assyrian sources, it's even called the state of Armani. And I know that there is a certain amount of scholars who do think that the Armenians derive their name from that state, even though the Armenians, of course, have a different name for themselves. Yeah, yes. So this, that in itself, yeah, I know that some Armenians think that their name should be connected with Hayasha, which is a polity to the northeast of the Hittite. So Hayastan, right, is the name for Armenia in Armenian itself. And so Armenians will also connect their origins with Hayasha a little bit in the northeast of Turkey. So there are some conflicting ideas doing the rounds about how the names relate to ancient names.
Hi. Thank you so much for that wide-ranging and very erudite talk. Thank you, Petra. I'm going to put you on a little bit of a spot and ask you to talk about that DNA evidence that you just mentioned that you haven't yet fully assimilated. I've always been bothered by the use of the ancient DNA and linguistic evidence at the same time without knowing whether the ancient DNA comes from sites from which texts come and how we link the languages the people would have spoken. You could have taken the ancient DNA from farmers, and what we have in the textual evidence is an elite group that has a very different substance. So do you know enough about that book that you were referencing and about related literature to talk a little bit more about the relationship between the DNA studies and linguistic studies and how those might complement one another and conflict? Thank you.
This is actually my first point of criticism for the articles that discuss the Anatolian DNA, is that they call that Hittite, right? And I claim you cannot possibly say that because what we have in Anatolia is a very strong admixture. There's nothing pure you can find. You cannot say, so I think you can use ancient DNA if you can find large movements, population movements. I think you can use it for that. But using 6, it was based on 6, I counted. And I wanted more. I assumed there was more evidence. But what I have found thus far is every claim about DNA from Anatolia is based on 6 bone fragments. From a Hittite site, that's correct. But I don't think they are Hittites. I think they are Hattians and Luwians, if you can even say that at that time. So the DNA we're going to find is always going to look very different from the DNA that we find in the steppe. So how do I think you can use it? I think you can use it because there's such a large Caucasian component. That DNA comes from the East. And so whatever happened, whether they are Hittites or Hattians or Luwians, they came from the East. What we really need is much more DNA samples from a much wider area. We would need DNA from West Anatolia or the East. Well, everywhere basically, not just from a few Hittite sites. And then we would have to, for example, exclude the presence of Hattians. So it's going to be complicated, but what we need is much more. I do think that the Eastern signal is going to be important. Yeah.
what was the Czech word again that you had up on the screen?
Litost. I don't know how to pronounce it exactly. Litost. Can I go faster? No, I guess not. The closest definition is a state of agony and torment created by the sudden sight of one's own misery. So that was it.
First, thank you, and a question from another immigrant with an accent, of course. How does the hypothesis of Gamkrelidze and Ivanov fit into that dichotomy, I should say?
So Gamkrelidze and Ivanov, they claim that the homeland of the Indo-Europeans is in the east of Turkey. Let's find a map. Better map. Well, a little bit. So they say it's from here. Also in Anatolia, out of Anatolia theory. But then I will use my claim about agricultural terminology. I only use one word, but there are more words you can use to show that there is no consistent vocabulary to express terms for agriculture. This is what you would expect. As I said, if you use it for one homeland, you should use it for another. Trying to find the other homeland. And the fact that the terminology for agriculture in the Anatolian languages is different from the terminology for agriculture in the other Indo-European languages tells me that they were not in an area with agriculture when they split. But this, Eastern Anatolia, it's surrounded by societies that had agriculture already around 9,000, 10,000, like 9,000 BC. So either you say they are extremely early, but that's not what Gamkrelidze and Ivanov say. To be honest, I do not know exactly when they posit the split, but you run into serious time issues with this. So that would be my argument against that.
We do have one more
Ready?
question.
Thanks, Petra. I do have questions about agriculture. You probably are not surprised about
Not
that.
surprised, no.
I'm glad to hear that there are more than one word for agriculture that you're basing your theory on. Do you remember what kind of words these are that you trace for agriculture?
So for example, the word for grain, very crucial. It's kind of granum, grain, that's all over the place. Corn is derived from that. So if you look at all the other Indo-European languages, they have all words that are based on something that is similar to grain. Hittite has chalki, no resemblance. Another word is shepit. I still have to read the article fully. That also has to do with, is a type of grain, barley perhaps. That seems to be shared with Semitic. I did not look at what a word is in the other branches. Oh, the word for milk, even. Even the word for milk. Milk is quite the same throughout all the non-Anatolian Indo-European languages. So milk, of course, has to do with domestication of animals, unless you think of trying to milk a wild mare or something. But no, don't do that. So milk is also a symbol, it's also a sign that you have agriculture. The word for milk is presumably, we don't even know for sure, is menua. Menua. Doesn't look, I mean, it starts with me, but you know, that's not enough to say that they are alike. So the word for milk is different. The word for grain is different, for another type of grain. The act of plowing is different. So
No,
that's what I, for now.
The reason I ask is
Okay.
because if you're going to look at Neolithic diffusion, which is what Renfrew theorized, this is early agriculture. And this is before the secondary product revolution of the 4th millennium BC.
Yes.
And so terms like milk or plowing, which are connected to animal traction and animal secondary products, are posterior to the spread that Renfrew looked at in most of these Neolithic spread.
Yeah.
So the terms for grains, names of cereals are going to be crucial, but I'd be wary to use terms that are connected to a secondary production stage in ancient agriculture that would have evolved after that spread that Renfrew theorized. I'm not saying that he's right, but I would be cautious to use these terms because these we know are connected to a change in production that dates to the 4th millennium BC and not earlier.
So the thing is, Renfrew completely rejects linguistic paleontology, by the way. So he would never use terminology. Yeah. Thank you. I will think about that.
Well, thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking Petra for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
And please join us for a reception in our museum. Thank you very much.